The nurse had just changed my IV when my phone buzzed on the bedside table. I almost didn't answer. After the bypass surgery, every movement felt like dragging myself through wet concrete, and I'd told the ward clerk to hold my calls. But the screen said my daughter, and a father always picks up. "Hey, Dad." Her voice was bright. Too bright. The kind of bright that meant something was wrong, and she was covering it with cheerfulness, the way she used to when she was 16 and had dented the car. I said, "Hey," back and waited. "So, listen," she started. "Big news. Theo and I got married. Last weekend, actually. Just the two of us at the courthouse. Nothing fancy, you know how we are." Congratulations, I thought. Now what comes next? And the thing is, Dad, with us starting our life together, we figured it was time to be practical. About the house. About your workshop. We talked to a realtor and got things moving. The sale went through on Wednesday. I knew you'd understand. She kept talking. Something about how the stairs were bad for my heart, how Theo had found me a nice one-bedroom near their place in Kelowna, how this was really the best thing for everyone. I lay there with the phone against my ear and the IV dripping steadily, and I thought about Wednesday. Wednesday was the day I'd been in the ICU. Wednesday was the day my surgeon had told my daughter that I might not make it through the night. She'd gone and sold my house on the day she thought I might be dying. I waited until she finished. Then I said quietly, without any anger at all, "Did Theo happen to look at the deed before the sale went through?" Silence. I said, "The whole deed, both pages." More silence. I almost laughed, lying there in that hospital bed with tubes in my arm and monitors beeping. I almost laughed because I'd spent 40 years in property law before I retired. And when my daughter had first brought Theo home 2 years ago, something about the way he'd looked around my workshop, not with admiration, but with calculation, had made me call my old colleague the very next week. I didn't say any of that to her. I just said, "Get some rest, sweetheart. We'll talk when I'm back on my feet." Then I hung up and stared at the ceiling for a long time. My name is not important. What is important is that I am 67 years old. I spent the better part of 4 decades helping other people protect what they'd built, and I had not for one single day, expected to need that knowledge for my own family. I grew up in Saskatoon. My father was a carpenter who built kitchen cabinets and porch railings, and, twice, an entire house from the foundation up. My mother kept the books for his business and raised 4 children and still found time to grow a kitchen garden that the whole neighborhood admired. They were practical people. They believed in paying cash when you could, and keeping your paperwork in order, and not borrowing trouble before it arrived. I went to law school at Dalhousie, married a woman named Roseanne who was studying nursing, and who laughed at all my terrible jokes. We moved back west to Penticton because Roseanne's parents were there and we wanted to be close. I opened a small practice. Roseanne worked at the hospital. We bought a house on a steep street with a view of the lake and a workshop in the backyard that I claimed I needed for projects and mostly used to think in peace. We had one daughter. We called her Blythe. I don't know why I chose that name. It just seemed right. She was born in February during a snowstorm, and from the first day she was opinionated and energetic and curious about everything, and I loved her with a fierceness that still surprises me when I think about it. Roseanne died 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. Blythe was 24. She came home for the last 3 weeks and sat with her mother every day, and when it was over she went quiet in a way I hadn't seen before and didn't know how to reach. She moved to Vancouver, found work in marketing. Came home for Christmas most years. We talked on the phone every week or two. Easy conversations that covered the surface of things without going very deep. I told myself that was normal, that adult children pull away, that she was grieving in her own way, that I should give her space. Then she met Theo. He was from Ontario somewhere, mid-30s, worked in real estate development, which meant he spent other people's money building things other people would eventually be unhappy about. He was handsome in a calculated way, the kind of handsome that comes from knowing which clothes fit and how to hold a room. The first time I met him, he shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said, "Sir, your daughter has told me so much about you. I've heard you had quite a distinguished career in property law." Something about the word distinguished bothered me. Not the word itself, the timing of it, the fact that he'd led with it. I called my old colleague Claude Renard the following Monday. Claude had been in property law longer than I had, and had an instinct for trouble that I'd always admired. I told him I wanted to revisit my estate documents, all of them. He asked if something had happened. I said, "Not yet." He understood. We spent 2 afternoons at his office in Penticton going through everything. My will, my power of attorney, the deed to the house, the paperwork for the workshop, which was technically a separate parcel. Claude listened to what I told him about Theo. Not the facts, which were thin, but the feeling, the way he'd looked at the workshop, and he didn't laugh. "Here's what you can do," he said. "We can restructure the deed with a protective clause. Anything that triggers a sale without your written consent at a licensed notary goes into dispute automatically. The title is clouded until it's resolved in court." He looked at me over his reading glasses. "It means nobody can move fast. Whatever they're planning, they'll have to slow down." "Do it," I said. We also updated my power of attorney. My POA named my friend of 30 years, a retired RCMP officer named Douglas Fent, who lived 20 minutes from me and had the kind of steadiness that couldn't be rattled. Not Blythe. Not anymore. I felt strange doing it. Disloyal, almost. Blythe was my daughter. She was Roseanne's daughter. And maybe I was wrong about Theo. Maybe I was a suspicious old man, projecting worst-case scenarios onto a man whose only crime was loving my daughter. But I thought about all the clients I'd had over the years, the ones who came to me after the damage was done, who sat across from my desk with their faces hollowed out and said, "I didn't think he'd really do it." I thought about how every single one of them had felt a warning they'd ignored. I did not ignore mine. 18 months later, I had the bypass surgery. It wasn't a shock, exactly. My cardiologist had been monitoring a blockage for 2 years. We'd tried medication, lifestyle changes, the usual progression of compromises before the unavoidable thing. The surgery was scheduled. I had time to prepare. I told Douglas, who already had the updated POA documents. I told my neighbor Barb, who had a key to the house and would collect the mail. I told Blythe, who said she'd fly in from Kelowna. She'd moved there 6 months earlier, chasing Theo's latest development project. And she did fly in the night before. She sat with me the morning of the surgery. We talked about ordinary things. She held my hand when they wheeled me down the corridor. I don't remember the surgery itself. I remember waking up in the ICU with a breathing tube that tasted like plastic and a nurse who had kind eyes and kept saying, "You did great, Mr. Whitaker. You did really great." It turns out Blythe left the hospital that evening, before I was moved to a regular room. I didn't know until later that she'd gone back to Kelowna, or that she and Theo had spent the following 2 days meeting with a realtor. The sale went through on Wednesday, the day the surgeon had pulled Blythe aside and said that my heart had shown some unexpected strain in the night, that the next 48 hours were critical. She'd called me from the hospital lobby crying, "Dad, you have to be okay. You have to fight." And then she'd gotten in a car with her husband and driven to Kelowna and signed papers selling the house where her mother had died. I found out most of this from Barb Kessler had been my neighbor for 22 years. She was 71 and had strong opinions about property maintenance, and even stronger opinions about people who didn't deserve what they had. She'd seen the realtor's car in my driveway. She'd seen strangers walking through the yard with clipboards. She'd called me at the hospital, and I'd been too drugged to understand what she was saying, so she'd called Douglas instead, and Douglas had called Claude, and by the time Blythe called me with the bright voice and the big news, Claude already had papers drafted. The protective clause had flagged the transfer within 48 hours. The title was in dispute. The sale wasn't clean. It could not proceed without a court order, and to get a court order, the buyer would have to prove there was no encumbrance, which they could not do because there was one I had put there myself, quietly and deliberately, 18 months earlier. I lay in my hospital bed and thought about all of this, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a very old, very tired grief. Because a man can be right about a thing and still wish, with his whole chest, that he'd been wrong. The first week of recovery was mostly sleep. Douglas came twice, sitting in the chair by the window and talking about nothing in particular. Hockey scores, a fishing trip he was planning, whether the Okanagan was going to have another dry summer. He had the gift of comfortable silence, and he used it freely. I didn't have to explain myself to Douglas. He already understood. Claude called with updates. The buyers, a couple from Abbotsford named Hartigan, had been furious at the complication. Their agent had represented to them that the title was clear. It was not. They had already talked to their own lawyer. "Good," Claude said. "That makes them co-complainants against the people who misrepresented the sale, not adversaries against you." "And Theo?" I asked. "What was his exposure?" Claude was quiet for a moment. He used an expired power of attorney, an old one that predated our restructuring. He must have found it in your files at some point. He altered the date. It's visible if you know what to look for, and a notary should have known what to look for. So there's exposure there too. I thought about when Theo might have had access to my files. The previous Christmas, when they'd visited and I'd given them the guest room. I'd come downstairs in the middle of the night for a glass of water and seen light under the door of my study. I'd thought he couldn't sleep. I'd gone back to bed. I told Claude to proceed with everything. File the fraud complaint. Notify the notary's licensing body. Document all of it. And Blythe, he asked. I didn't answer right away. The monitor beeped steadily beside me. Let me talk to her first, I said. She called 3 days later. I let it go to voicemail. Then I called back that evening when I felt strong enough for whatever was coming. Dad, she said immediately. I'm so sorry. I've been wanting to call. I didn't know how. I didn't say anything. The buyers are threatening to sue, she said. Theo says it's complicated. He says there must have been some mix-up with the documents. I said, there was no mix-up, Blythe. Silence. The power of attorney he used expired 14 months ago, I said, and the date on it was changed. That's not a mix-up. That's a crime. Her breath came out unsteady. Dad, I didn't know. I didn't know about any documents. He said you'd agreed to sell. He said you'd talked about it before the surgery, that you wanted to downsize before you got home, that it would be too much for you. And you believed him. She didn't answer. I said it again, gently. You believed him over me, without calling me, without asking my lawyer, without doing anything except signing your name. I could hear her crying. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I waited until she was quieter. Then I said, when did you start borrowing money from him, Blythe? More silence. Then, how did you know? Because I know you, I said. You wouldn't have done this on your own. You're not that person. But you might have done it if you felt like you didn't have a choice. She told me then. Over the previous year and a half, she'd taken out 3 loans from Theo's personal account to cover debts she'd accumulated before they met. A line of credit, a car loan, some money she'd borrowed from a friend she hadn't been able to pay back. She hadn't wanted to tell me. She'd been ashamed. Theo had offered to help without judgment, and she'd been grateful, and then the help had come with expectations she hadn't understood when she'd agreed to them. We needed the equity, she said, from the house, to pay back the loans he'd made to me, to pay back money he'd lent you, I said, which he'd used to fund a development project he couldn't otherwise finance. She didn't answer. The cycle was familiar to me. I'd seen it in practice a dozen times. The loan that creates the obligation that creates the leverage that gets used when the moment is right. I said, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Did you know the power of attorney was altered? No, she said immediately. No, Dad, I swear to God. He told me it was current. He showed it to me and I didn't look closely enough. I should have. I should have called Claude myself. I trusted him. There it was. The oldest sentence in the world. I just trusted him. I said, I know, I believe you. She cried again, harder this time. I said, listen to me, this is going to get complicated, and it's going to be public, and it's going to be very uncomfortable. The buyers are involved now. Claude is filing documents. The RCMP may want to talk to you. The RCMP, she whispered. Yes, because your name is on those papers. You're going to need your own lawyer, Blythe. Someone who represents your interests specifically. Not Theo's interests, yours. She was quiet. Then she said, he doesn't know I'm talking to you. Good. Keep it that way for now. After we hung up, I sat in the semi-dark of the hospital room and thought about Roseanne, about what she would have done with all of this. She'd been a nurse for 30 years and had seen every kind of human behavior in the worst possible circumstances, and she'd never lost her capacity for judgment or her capacity for compassion. She'd held both at once without letting either cancel the other. I thought I knew what she would have said. She would have said, help your daughter, not Theo. Your daughter. Douglas came the next morning and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities. Here's what I think you should do, he said when I finished. He had always been direct. You fight for the house because that's right and because it can be won. You help Blythe because she's your kid and she made a bad decision, not a bad life. And you let the law handle Theo because that's what the law is for. He paused. What you don't do is let any of this sit. Things that sit get complicated in the wrong ways. He was right. They always got complicated in the wrong ways. Claude had already been busy. The protective clause had done what it was designed to do. The Hardigans could not take possession, could not close, could not move forward. Their lawyer had contacted Claude, and once the situation was explained, had pivoted quickly from adversarial to cooperative. They wanted the money they'd paid in good faith returned. They wanted the agent sanctioned. They had no interest in fighting a retired property lawyer who had clearly set this whole thing up on purpose. "We are not your problem," the Hardigan lawyer wrote in her email to Claude. "Your son-in-law is your problem. We are simply people who got caught in the middle of a family situation that was misrepresented to us." Claude showed me the email from his laptop on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after I'd been moved from the ICU to a regular room. "What happens to them?" I asked. "Their deposit is returned. The sale is voided. They walk away whole," he said. "The realtor's errors and omissions insurance may cover some of the complications on their end, but that's between them and the agent. And the house returns to your name, unencumbered, once the court grants the quiet title order." He gave me a measured look. "Which it will. The case is straightforward. All the fraud did was create extra paperwork." I thought about the house, about the workshop in the backyard where Roseanne had once painted a birdhouse over a summer weekend and gotten red paint on her left shoe that wouldn't come out, about the kitchen where we'd had breakfast every morning for 22 years, about the steep street with the view of the lake that changed color depending on the time of day and the angle of the light. What they'd done hadn't been able to change any of that. It had only created paperwork. "Good," I said. 3 weeks after the surgery, I was well enough to leave the hospital. Barb came and got me in her Subaru, which smelled like dog and pine air freshener, and drove me to her house, where she'd set up a cot in the spare room and stocked the refrigerator with more food than I could eat in a month. "You don't have to do all this," I told her. "Yes, I do," she said, and went back to the kitchen. Barb had a dog named Clarence who was 12 years old and arthritic, and spent most of his time on a fleece blanket near the heating vent. He was the most non-demanding creature I'd ever encountered. We got along very well. I'd sit in the chair across from his blanket, and he'd look at me with his old eyes, and sometimes I'd talk to him about things I wasn't ready to say out loud to anyone else. I'd talk to him about Blythe, about the fact that I could understand how it had happened, the loneliness after her mother died, the gratitude toward someone who offered help without conditions, the slow realization that the conditions had always been there, just hidden. I understood it. I was still hurt by it. Both things were true. I talked to him about Theo, about the particular kind of person who looks at a grieving young woman and a retired widower with a paid-off house and sees an opportunity, about how they always present themselves as helpful, how the help always comes first and the leverage always comes later, and by the time you see what's happening, the hook is already in. Clarence would look at me and blink slowly, and I would feel, unreasonably, that he agreed. Douglas helped me go through the documents Barb had retrieved from my house. She'd gone in with her key before anything could be touched. My files were intact. Theo had found the old POA but hadn't known about the newer one, the one that named Douglas. There was a recording on my office answering machine, old-fashioned, I know, but I'd never replaced it, of a call Theo had made 2 weeks before the surgery, asking about the mortgage history on the house, what the outstanding balance was, whether I'd considered a reverse mortgage. He'd been fishing. The call was dated and time-stamped. Claude added it to the file. The fraud complaint was filed with the RCMP. The notary who'd processed the paperwork was reported to the Society of Notaries. The Kelowna realtor's errors and omissions were documented. Blythe had gotten her own lawyer, a woman in Kelowna named, well, Blythe called her Fierce, which was probably recommendation enough. She'd told her lawyer everything. Her lawyer had told her that cooperation with the RCMP investigation was in her interest, and that her exposure, given that she hadn't known about the document alteration, was likely limited. She called me every few days. We didn't always talk about the legal situation. Sometimes we talked about other things, careful ordinary things, rebuilding the habit of talking. She told me she'd moved out of the house she and Theo shared. She was staying with a friend. "How are you doing?" I asked her once. Actually, she was quiet for a moment. "I feel like an idiot," she said. "You're not an idiot. You were in a situation with someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I should have seen it. Maybe. But so should a lot of people who ended up in rooms across from my desk over the years. Smarter people than either of us. It doesn't mean you're foolish. It means he was patient." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I wish I'd talked to you more. After Mom died, I didn't know how. I said, I didn't either. That was probably the most honest thing we'd said to each other in 8 years. The quiet title hearing was 5 weeks after my discharge. Claude had petitioned for expedited consideration given the circumstances, my medical situation, the buyers left in limbo, the clear and documented evidence of fraud. The judge granted it. I walked into that courtroom on my own. I'd been doing the physiotherapy seriously. The cardiac rehabilitation, the slow daily walks up and down Barb's Street, until I could manage a full block without stopping. My chest still ached in the cold, but I moved steadily, and I held my cane with what I hoped looked like authority rather than necessity. The Hartigans were there, sitting with their lawyer. We nodded to each other across the aisle. They looked tired and irritated in the way people look when they've been dragged into someone else's mess and just want it resolved. Theo was not there. He had retained a lawyer who filed a written response claiming the power of attorney had been valid at the time of use, and that any irregularities in the date were the result of administrative error. Administrative error. 40 years in property law, and I'd heard some creative explanations, but that one made me press my lips together to keep from saying something the judge would have had to notice. The judge, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, reviewed everything Claude had filed and asked 3 questions. The third one was directed at me directly. Mr. Whitaker, can you confirm for the record that you did not authorize this sale? I said clearly and without hesitation, I did not. She wrote something down. Then she ruled. The title returned to my name. The sale was voided. The Hartigans' deposit was to be returned from the proceeds held in escrow, with interest. The matter of the fraudulent power of attorney was referred to the Crown for further proceedings. The fraud case was separate. It was proceeding on its own timeline. The RCMP had located Theo, still in Kelowna, and he'd been interviewed. I didn't know what he'd said. Claude said it didn't matter much what he said. The evidence said most of what needed saying. Walking out of that courthouse into the November cold, I stopped on the top step and just breathed for a moment. Douglas appeared beside me. Ready? Yes, I said. Barb was waiting in the Subaru with Clarence in the back seat. Clarence wagged his tail when I got in, which was generous of him considering how little he normally moved. I'd asked Claude to meet us at the house. I wanted someone there the first time I walked back in, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because some moments are better witnessed. The key still worked. Of course it did. The locks hadn't been changed, because the sale hadn't completed, because everything was exactly as it had been left, except for a few things out of place in the study, where someone had clearly been looking for something. I stood in the front hall and looked at the stairs and the coat rack where Roseanne's old rain jacket still hung, because I'd never been able to move it, and the framed photograph on the wall of the 2 of us at Whistler this summer before she was diagnosed. Barb squeezed my arm. Claude put a hand briefly on my shoulder. Douglas stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, giving me the space to have whatever I needed to have. I said, I'm going to go sit in the workshop for a few minutes. Go ahead, Douglas said. The workshop was cold and smelled like sawdust and machine oil the way it always had. The project I'd been working on before the surgery was still clamped to the workbench. A writing box I was making for Blythe, actually. A reproduction of one I'd seen in a museum years ago, small and neat with a hinged lid and a brass clasp. I'd been planning to give it to her at Christmas. I sat on the stool by the bench and looked at it. Then I picked up my sandpaper and started where I'd left off. Blythe came to see me do sticks after I was back in the house. She drove down from Kelowna on a Saturday, arrived mid-morning, stood on the porch, and looked like she was 12 years old again, waiting to be told if she was in trouble. I opened the door and said, Come in. I'll make coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. She kept her hands wrapped around her mug. She looked thinner than I'd seen her in a while, and tired, and something else. Lighter. Maybe. The way people look when they've been carrying something heavy and have finally set it down, even though the shoulders still ache. I'm sorry, she said. She'd said it before, but this time it was different, more specific. I'm sorry for what you had to go through, for what I did, for believing him over you. I said, I know you are. I'm sorry for the past 8 years, too, she said, for not being here, for not, she stopped. I didn't know how to come back after Mom. It felt easier to be somewhere else. And then Theo made it even easier because he was someone else's life and I could just step into it and stop thinking about this one. I set my coffee down. I thought about all the things I could say. The careful things. The therapeutic things about grief and distance and the way families fracture and sometimes repair. Instead, I said, Your mother used to say, That grief is just love with nowhere to go. I think that's right. I think you had a lot of love with nowhere to go, and you went looking for somewhere to put it, and he wasn't the right place. She started crying then, quietly, the way she'd cried the day of Roseanne's funeral, sitting very still and letting the tears run without making a sound. I'm going to tell you something, I said, and I want you to hear it clearly. She looked at me. I was angry. I was hurt. I am still, a little. But you are my daughter, and what happened here, I could have lost this house. But I didn't, because I prepared. Because Claude and Douglas and a good deed clause kept it safe. And because of all the things that happened in the last 2 months, you cooperating, you telling the truth, you getting your own lawyer, that's yours. That's you choosing right when it mattered. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Are you going to stay in the house?" "Yes," I said. "I am." She nodded. "What about, can I come and visit?" "Not move back. I don't mean that. Just visit." "Any time," I said. We finished our coffee. I showed her the writing box. She ran her fingers along the lid and didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "It's beautiful, Dad." "It's yours," I said, "when it's finished." The criminal case moved slowly, the way those things do. Theo was charged with fraud over $5,000 and forgery of a document. His lawyer mounted the administrative error defense, which the Crown treated with the same respect I had, which is to say, very little. The notary was disciplined by the society, and her license was suspended pending review. I gave a victim impact statement. I kept it short. I talked about what it means to build a life in a place, to have 40 years in a community, to have worked hard and planned carefully and still be vulnerable to the people who are supposed to be on your side. I talked about my wife and what the house had meant to both of us. I said what I needed to say. I did not editorialize about Theo beyond the facts. The judge sentenced him to 18 months plus 2 years probation. His lawyer would appeal. These things always get appealed. But the sentence was on the record, and the record was permanent. I wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing. I read about it from Claude's email at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in February, with snow coming down outside the window and a pot of tea going on the stove. Douglas called that evening. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm going to go sand something in the workshop," I said. "That's a yes," he said. Barb brought a casserole over. Clarence sat on the porch in the cold for 3 minutes before deciding it wasn't worth it and going back to his blanket. I ate the casserole and watched the snow and thought about what comes after. Blythe calls every Sunday now, sometimes twice a week. She's looking at apartments in Penticton. Not to crowd me, she says, but she's been in Kelowna for 2 years and doesn't see the point anymore. She's been talking to a therapist, which I think is long overdue. She sounds more like herself than she has in years. More like the daughter who used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework while her mother made dinner, arguing about something or other, full of opinions and energy, and the particular fierce love she'd always had for the people she claimed. I finished the writing box last week. The brass clasp fit perfectly on the first try, which almost never happens. I wrapped it carefully and put it on the shelf in the workshop to wait. Blythe is coming down in April. She mentioned she'd always liked the drive in spring, when the valley starts to green up again and the orchards come back. She's right about that. It's a good drive. I think about my father sometimes, about the way he built things carefully and without shortcuts and expected them to last. I think about the clause in my deed and how it held, how one quiet afternoon with Claude and a clearly written document had changed everything. I think about how preparation isn't pessimism. It's just love with a plan behind it. I have a view of the lake from my kitchen window. It changes color with the light, blue in the morning, gray in the afternoon, something close to gold when the sun gets low. I've been looking at it for 22 years, and it still stops me sometimes. The house is mine. My daughter is coming home. That's enough. That's more than enough.